Hi, I'm Brandy Dunham, and I'm coming to you from Angelo State University Counseling Services. I am a counselor here, and I'm sitting here with Colt Owen, who is
Hello.
also a counselor here at Angelo State. He has 3 years of experience in counseling and higher education. He was also a TA for the ASU Psychology and Kinesiology departments, and he's completed both of his degrees, his bachelor and master's degrees from ASU, so he's an alumni.
Sure am. Go Rams.
Welcome, Colt. Welcome. And we're going to just say this is Brewing with Brandy. So this is a psychoeducational series that we are going to have, and this is the first of many that we're going to make. Colt, how do you like your coffee?
So I typically take mine with a little bit of the hazelnut creamer. Always like to have it on hand. So Brandy, how do you take your coffee?
I think my coffee is served best with great friends. All right, Colt, so let's get into it. Tell me about yourself. What inspired you to become a counselor?
Well, I think it really started back when I was on the football team here, and my path was going to be being a football coach, going that realm. Tore
Mm-hmm.
my ACL here about my second year playing, so about my sophomore year,
Okay.
and realized it was more of the mental side of athletics I enjoyed than rather the playing and the coaching. So I thought first like, oh, more sports psych, things like that. And then once I got into the graduate program, graduate counseling psychology program, realized it was really working with college age students that I really enjoyed. So I kind of
Oh.
finalized my shift towards, oh, I want to be present, be there for people to talk about their issues with, talk about like setting goals, all those things. So that kind of moved me towards mental health, but even more specifically, college mental health.
Yes, and I do know that you work with our athletes. You and I are the two counselors designated here to work with the athletes, and so that's just right up your alley. Then I
Absolutely.
know that he does amazing work. So
So does Brandy.
yeah. So what psychotherapy framework do you prefer to use when counseling?
I am pretty CBT focused.
Okay.
I hate to say any specific modality for any situation because, there is some give and take and some interweaving of modalities, but
Right.
CBT is a strong basis of mine, and I think I have Dr. Curtis to thank for that somewhat. But, he said that he would not push that upon us, but just the way problems were phrased, I think it makes the most sense to me and
Mm-hmm.
kind of how I address problems day to day, even in my own life, are kind of through the framework of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all interconnecting. So I'd say CBT for sure.
CBT, yeah, and so that does stand for cognitive behavioral therapy, and so yes, Colt is very versed in CBT. Thank you, Dr. Curtis. What disorder would you like to discuss today, Colt?
So I had thought through a few, but I think social anxiety would be a good place to start this little series off.
Yeah. Social anxiety is one of our most attended reason for attending counseling here. We have a lot of students who experience social anxiety and symptoms of social anxiety. So tell me about some features of the disorder.
So when we think about social anxiety, so I'm going to use the word heightened.
Okay.
So when we talk about heightened specifically with anxiety, because we'll talk about in a little bit like anxiety being a natural part of life. So
Right.
heightened in this circumstance would be anxiety situations about where we could be appraised by others. So there could be social situations like talking with somebody, even
Mm-hmm.
somebody you know, someone you don't know. So those social interactions or other situations we could be appraised, like presentations, filming a video,
Right.
things like that. So something where appraisal is possible. So what I mean by heightened is kind of incongruent with the actual dangers presented by the situation. So that would mean like if I feel like I'm getting chased by a lion every time I go up to the counter at Taco Bell to get more sauce, that may be a little more heightened or incongruent with the actual situation itself.
Okay, I like that, and that is so accurate. I like your metaphor there, being chased by a lion when you go up to the order Taco Bell, because that is what a lot of our students with social anxiety feel. They feel a very heightened sense of anxiety when in social situations. So, how is it diagnosed? How would you diagnose this disorder if someone comes in?
So thinking of diagnosis as a way that we inform treatment and as a set of symptoms that occur together. So clinical interview, of course, is a big thing here at the
Mm,
master's level.
yep.
So using the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, using some of those criteria to kind of evaluate through that discussion of how is this impacting your life. So if it's, we're coming in, we're just going to broad spokes talk about like what's been going on. Like, well, every time I go talk to people, or most of the time when I'm talking to others, I feel this strong beating in my chest, or we feel these, again, heightened anxiety symptoms in situations maybe I feel like or believe don't necessarily call for them. So clinical interview is one of the major things that we do.
Okay.
Of course, there is the idea of doing a full psychological evaluation through someone with a doctorate in our field, so a psychologist, psychiatrist. But being at the master's level, clinical interview is mainly the thing we'd focus on.
Okay. And are there any assessments? You talked about the doctoral level of this. Are there any assessments that are used to help diagnose disorder, or is it mainly clinical interview?
Clinical interview is a huge part. There are some assessments. So thinking more of like, again, from our level, what folks could see if they're coming in here would be the CCAPS. So the Counseling Center Assessment of Psychological Symptoms, something you'll get with the intake, as well as you'll get a shortened version. So the long version is the CCAPS 62, shortened version is the 34. So it's a battery of multiple different concerns. Depression, generalized anxiety, and social anxiety are some of the big ones on there. So taking that, and something I like to think about assessment too. So assessment helps inform treatment, helps inform diagnosis, helps inform treatment. But simply because someone rates high on the CCAPS doesn't necessarily mean that that's their major concern or the thing they're coming in for. It's just something maybe of discussion.
Right. It just shows some symptomology in that area for sure. All right. So what have you found makes someone believe that they have this disorder, and how is their day affected?
So again, thinking of that word significant or heightened, so situations like you're going and ordering in a fast food place and you can feel your heart beating, you feel those physiological symptoms. Maybe thinking from the CBT framework, we're having those negative automatic thoughts, the thoughts of, oh, I'm going to make a fool of myself, people are going to not like me, I'm stupid for thinking this way, things like that. So impacting most, if not all, social interactions. Don't like to use absolutes a lot, but think of most social interactions, or just most times, like if you're going in front of a class, or maybe you have some sort of project where you have to get up and present. Going beyond the level of functional anxiety, because anxiety at its core is this fear of a lack of control, but also it is a functional part of our lives. There's a reason we haven't grown to move past it completely, because there is this optimal zone for most activities. So the Yerkes-Dodson model talks about this optimal level of arousal for most activities, both mental and physical. We would think, oh, maybe it's towards the lower end of anxiety, when typically it's more towards that median end of I'm engaged, I'm excited, I'm glad to be here, but not on the far end of kind of what we've been talking about, heightened, non-congruent with the situation. So like if you're walking down the mall on campus, someone looks in your direction, gives you kind of a weird look. Some negative automatic thought could be like, oh, what's wrong with me? Did I step in something? My shoes are all weird. I knew my hair was stupid today. Things like that. Makes us feel probably self-conscious behavior. I'm going to run to the UC, get out of here. So some things that could, you could see day to day.
Okay, so I like that. So what I heard in more of like simpler terms is that like not a typical amount of anxiety, so more of an abnormal amount of anxiety, because we all have anxiety. Anxiety can be good, it can be used for good, it can be a warning, right? And so this would be something beyond that typical amount of anxiety that we would have in a social situation. For sure. Okay, I like that. Okay, is this disorder chronic? And what length of time on average would someone have this disorder?
So when we think of anxiety disorders in general, so social anxiety, generalized anxiety, again, with it being a normal part of life, having some semblance of anxiety, we think more about management of symptoms. So like how are we able to feel functional in our day-to-day life and notice when maybe we are heightened or when those things are peaking up, and using some coping skills, maybe learned through therapy, to help bring us back down to that optimal level of performance. So we think about duration, it's really more the thought of management of those symptoms.
Okay. And on to management, how is this disorder treated or managed?
So kind of jumping back to what we talked about before, the CBT stuff. So one way we'd go about that as well is maybe some exposure exercises, which kind of sometimes when folks come in for certain anxiety disorders, it's not the most exciting thing to hear. So that's why I often try to use language of, do you feel like this would be helpful, rather than do you want to? So exposure would be, say you have heightened anxiety about having a one-on-one conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
So we may make a plan of like, okay, we're going to make, between now and the next time we see each other, we'll say talk to 10 or so different people for about 10 seconds each. Just get yourself out there, get some neutral and positive experiences to help inform, tying into the CBT, how we can challenge some negative thoughts that we're having. So we're able to get that real world experience, that evidence to help use in our thought challenging. And then thinking of, again, in those exposure situations, maybe we feel our heart start going. So having some coping skills like breathing exercises, so something like box breathing, some structured breathing, or progressive muscle relaxation. So starting from your feet and squeezing as hard as you can for 5 seconds, and then releasing for 5, and then moving up to your calves and to your thighs and to your core. Something that may not be noticeable to others, but is helping you get some of that tension out, as well as the idea of, flexing, releasing muscles, releasing endorphins, giving somewhere for that anxious energy to go, for non-medical, getting lost in the weeds terms.
Right. Okay. So you just said a couple of interventions, which is like desensitization and exposure therapy. Are there any other interventions you may try with someone who suffers from the disorder?
Well, when we think about coping skills in general, maybe breaking them down too into healthy and unhealthy coping skills. Okay. So something like, some folks have come in and they've used alcohol or some sort of substance as a way to lower their inhibitions. And it's like, they're like, well, this is effective for me. Why wouldn't I continue to do this? That's what we think of healthy versus unhealthy. It's like, we're not saying effective or useful versus not useful. It's like, is this something that you want to continue to use or that is useful in situations like you're anxious at work or you're anxious doing things day to day? Right. It's like, well, no. So it's like, okay, then maybe we could think of some ways, again, like the box breathing, the progressive muscle relaxation, things that we could do day to day that are more on the healthy side of coping.
I love that you just pointed that out, because that's like a huge aha moment for a lot of our students. Some things can be useful, right? Like alcohol can be useful in helping with social anxiety. We know that. Is it healthy? There's a difference between useful and healthy, and I like that you really pointed that out. That's very, very good. So is this a disorder in which you might refer your student for medication management? Why would you, and why wouldn't you?
It's a good question. So thinking of first on the wood side, maybe it would be somebody who has tried some of these things before, some of the CBT stuff, some of the thought challenging, the coping skills, and they're like, it has helped, but it hasn't really gotten me where I feel like I want to be. Okay. So it's like, okay, so maybe that in conjunction with medication. So consulting with a medical professional about that, what that could look like. And we've got a great clinic here for folks to seek out those resources. Yep. And having that while in therapy as well. Because while the medication could help with some of the physiological symptoms, some of the thoughts may still be there or may differ person to person. So that would be a reason I would refer. Kind of reason I wouldn't, maybe if somebody is resistant to the idea of medication. They're like, I really don't want to have something else have control over me. It's something that I've heard. And anxiety being this fear of a lack of control and desire for control in our lives. And two, thinking of my own therapeutic style, very focused on autonomy and giving people autonomy. Right. It's like, well, if we feel like we want to try to work just using the coping skills and the CBT stuff before we tried any exterior stuff like medication, that's awesome. Like, let's try to go on that path, and just letting them know their options, I think, is a big thing for me, because at the end of the day, it's not me making that decision for them. It's me being used as a resource to help them get to where they're wanting to be. Yeah, giving them the information and letting them choose what they feel is best for them. Sure. I like that. So can this disorder be mistaken for a different disorder? Absolutely. So there's the idea of panic disorder, so having frequent panic attacks, agoraphobia, so having the fear of being in public and not being able to escape, say if you are having a panic attack, just generalized anxiety disorder, so maybe being anxious about more things than just those social interactions, maybe just being on that heightened scale more often than not for multiple days in a row, more often than not. Again, I would think about DSM criteria for that, but it can be difficult sometimes to separate exactly what situations the anxiety is happening in. And that's something too, kind of tying it back to the clinical interview of talking about these situations, because oftentimes people will come in and just be like, oh, I'm anxious a lot. It's like, okay, let's talk about when you're anxious. And it seems like mainly when we're around other people or doing things with other people. So it's like, oh, okay, have we thought about this before? And sometimes we'll go, oh, no, I never really considered that. Because again, thinking about the functionality aspect of it, we are around other people a lot and interacting with people a lot. So it could be difficult to discern under your own fruition of like, when am I talking to others? When am I not? Is this causing some of this anxiety? That kind of a thing.
Right. And I like that you differentiated between other types of anxiety, and that's why the clinical interview is so important, because there are other types of anxiety, and someone who maybe suffers with like test anxiety or just generalized anxiety, that's very different than social anxiety. So very different. Does this disorder have any comorbid disorders?
So thinking of some straight from the DSM. So major depressive disorder, we see that oftentimes. So folks experiencing depressive symptoms, major depressive symptoms, along with the social anxiety symptoms. Panic disorder, something we talked about in that last question, as well as PTSD is a common one that's kind of comorbid with social anxiety disorder. So again, it'd be up to doing through the clinical interview, the diagnosis process of kind of figuring out maybe what is the antithesis of the presented problem. So it's like a common example we talk about that's not maybe social anxiety related, but if someone is having sleep issues and depressive symptoms, it's like, which one came first? Are the sleeping issues kind of
Right.
informing some of those depressive symptoms, or depressive symptoms informing the sleeping issues? So that may be some things that we look at as well.
Is it the chicken or the egg, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned depression, and to me that makes sense as a comorbid disorder for social anxiety. So somebody who may be new to college and does have social anxiety, maybe it is harder for them to get out there and make friends. That could like lead to low motivation and all those other depressive symptoms. So low mood and things like that. So I can see that as a comorbid, and the others as well. So why do you enjoy treating? What makes treating these people enjoyable for you, or what do you like about it?
That's a great question. So again, thinking of from my therapeutic style, I really am autonomy focused. So I love folks coming in and they're like, this has been going on. I am tired of this happening. I want to see some change in my life. It's like, awesome. How do we want to take ownership of that?
Yeah.
So like through these things, like in the language again of using like in the exposure exercises, do you feel like this could be helpful rather than do you want to do this? And they're like, I think it could be helpful. It's like, okay, awesome. Like, let's give it a try. And seeing the pride that they have in themselves oftentimes when they accomplish these things. And I can never make a promise that it would make someone feel better or not feel better or anything like that. But just growing that out, seeing that autonomy grow within them is something that's very encouraging on my end.
Yeah.
As well as just like finding out what motivates them to find this change in their life. Maybe they want to be a counselor one day, but have a really hard time talking with people one-on-one, or just maybe expressing their thoughts or those things like that. So kind of talking through, making those goals with them and seeing them reach those goals. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones doing the work, and I'm just there to help kind of guide them through it.
Yeah. I like that. I also enjoy treating people with this disorder, and one of the reasons is very similar to yours. It's just that if the student does the work, a lot of times we will see really good results. And I love watching that transition from having really high anxiety to it lowering, and being able to see that on their CCAPs, and to being able to celebrate that with them and watching them grow as a person and not having the disorder take over their whole social interactions.
Well, they're like, oh, I made a new friend today. Like I went
Yes.
up to somebody I've seen in class for the last 5 weeks, and I talked to them, and we have so much in common. It's just like, man, way to go. That's awesome.
Yeah, and their happiness is our happiness, and so it's just great to see. Have you seen Have you seen therapy help someone with this disorder? And if you can tell us a story, if you don't want to tell us a story, you don't have to.
Well, I think of a pretty vague one of using the exposure hierarchy of we started off, so I saw this person, quite a few times, upwards of 10.
Okay.
We started off early on thinking about like, let's have a 5-second conversation with like 3 people. They're like, oh, okay, cool. And then through our therapy, at the end of the time, we were having like full-on conversations with multiple people every day, going out and meeting people. They were coming up with their own ideas of like, oh, I think this could be helpful. Why don't we try doing this? I'm like, sounds great. Let's do that. So kind of seeing them again take over that autonomy of like, this is my treatment. This is what I'm wanting from it based off of what we've talked about. I feel like this could be helpful. It's like, I totally agree. Let's go do that. So those are always awesome times of when they see that ownership and they're like, okay, I see this stuff working. Let's keep going doing this stuff. That's why too I like doing those check-ins every couple sessions. Like, do you feel like this is what you're wanting out of therapy. 'Cause,
Yeah.
of course,
And is it working? Do you feel as if it's working? Are we moving toward your goals?
Mhm.
And so I also have that autonomy in my sessions, and I think it works really well to keep things on track and focused. All right, finally, last question of the interview is, what is your favorite quote to use in therapy? What if we polled 100 of your clients, 100 of them? I know you've had at least that many, at least. What would they say was Colt's favorite quote to use?
well, I've got one that they would say, and then I've got one for specifically social anxiety that I use. So the general one is, you can do anything but not everything. So I have that up in my office, a little printout I hang. And then specifically social anxiety is, if we can't fight the fear, do it scared. So I actually have that on the back of my notebook that I use in therapy. I've written a little sticky note that I'll flip over and show them sometimes, because I use it in my own life too, of being able to step back from my own anxieties sometimes in day-to-day life and be like, do I feel like this is something functional for me? Yes. Okay. I want to push through it. I want to push through that first 5 seconds. It made me feel super anxious. And then once I'm in the conversation, once I'm in whatever it is, I feel myself starting to calm down a little bit. So finding that initial fear to get to what I think is useful for myself.
I like that. I like that quote. And I have a similar one. I say it even if your voice is trembling, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. Well, thank you so much, Cole. Is there anything you want to add, or do you feel like you've kind of added everything? I think you've said it all. I don't know much more you could add, but
I think it went great. It was a lot of fun.
well, it was lovely having coffee with you.
Of course.
Until next time.
Cheers.